I've always had a love for the traditional quilts, and that's what I saw at home. My mother did all her own sewing. Now I change patterns around to suit myself, and I use fabric that I love, but I don't create my own patterns. I like to do the patterns that were done maybe in the 1800s. It seems to me these simple quilts that have the story behind them are really the most interesting ones. And that's what I've geared myself to. 2 years before I retired from teaching, I taught school for 37 years. I was anxious to get out and do something else. And it was quilting that was in my head all the time. And so in my research through quilting, I've always looked for the traditional patterns. My books are all books that would be geared for traditional quilting. Quilts like the Underground Railroad that has such a marvelous story behind it. Years ago, when the slaves were escaping, if there was a quilt out on the line and it had all baskets on it, then the slaves knew they could go into that house and be safe. They would get food. If there was a star or the flying geese, then they knew in what direction to go. Another one of the blocks that told a story was the bear paw, and that's a very traditional quilt and made centuries ago. And if there was a quilt out on the line and each block had a bear paw in it, then the slaves knew to take the bear paw path and they would be safe. So in that way, each of these blocks has a story to tell. And this is what people were really enthralled by. Now, that could be truth or fiction. I like to think it's true. So I've been teaching quilting classes around the island in Richmond County and Antigonish, Glendale, out in the country that way. Of course, here in town, I do them fall, winter, and spring. And I've done classes in Sydney and at retreats. I do all my quilting and my work out of my home and invite people, tourists, whomever are interested in quilting to come into my home and see what I do for quilting and how it's done. I use the old-fashioned cheap boards and clamps and legs to hold it up. I don't use one of the fancy ones that aren't really as good as being able to stretch your quilt out and quilt that way. Certainly, it's a great hobby, and I could go from morning to night doing nothing but quilting, sewing, quilting again, cutting, sewing, going through all my stash of fabric. I love fabric, and that would be another thing that has motivated me to quilt more. Is if I see a piece of fabric, then have to buy it.